Over the years, I've been involved in environmental work ranging from policy on the ground interventions and working with the ideas of nature as an artist and curator. And in India and other countries, the legal and policy making, the 2 points I'd like to make is my involvement in environmental policy and see where this whole hierarchy of the word environment, how it is fit in, and my other thinking on the idea of expanding the relationship between the self and nature. And then thinking about multi-species ideas. In the legal and policy-making processes related to the protection of the environment, they recognize only some of the harm being caused by human activities, such as distinct aspects of ecosystems like air, water, or soil, but do not recognize an non-anthropogenic position or agency. At the policy table, often are institutional stakeholders, natural scientists, engineers, bureaucrats, industry representatives, etc. Labor, including the informal sector, which incidentally constitutes the bulk of the economic activity in the country, is unrepresented, and the non-human human view largely absent. So there's a lot of invisibility in how environmental policy is developed. As part of my formal, and social scientists are frequently absent at the table as well. As part of my formal environmental engagements, I have participated in numerous processes to lay down environmental standards, draw up national environmental policies, or help write legal texts which constitute environmental laws. My training as an engineer and being part of an environmental not-for-profit organization have facilitated a place at the table as an environmentalist, where the world of natural science, technology, forensic evidence, wrapped in an invisible sphere of lobbyists, investors, and private interests is king. In the discussions, there are glaring omissions. For example, pollution is defined by its impact solely on human health and not on non-human or ecosystems. And there are very sort of strict protocols on how standards get made. The formal legal processes of regulation or compliance to such norms and laws decide what is just and unjust. The parallel worlds I inhabit, categorized as artists and environmentalists, exist, but do not necessarily converse with each other, even though they may be speaking of the same landscapes. And I'm in my presentation, I'm going to be showing as backdrop slides of my work. I don't necessarily speak about the works, but they're somehow referent to what I'm saying. It is apparent that these relationships are not captured by the terminology of environment as it is used, and needs a broader understanding of lived everyday experiences, where exclusions from nature form a basic underpinning. There is an unstated hierarchy of impacts which environmental laws and norms serve. Hence, air pollution becomes an issue in India after the capital city of Delhi becomes unbearably polluted for its middle-class citizens, even though poor women have been bearing its impact in smoky kitchens for decades. The conditions of the most vulnerable and its connection to the natural world are not fully acknowledged or factored in. When working with the anthropologist Jan Bremen, photographing the migrancy of labor from the village to the city, I better understood the powerlessness of the economically poor and the lack of ability to participate in formal political processes. The multiple dimensions of exclusions of those whose lives were invisible became clearer to me, though their landlessness or separations caused by caste and gender. And this is sort of, gender has been more and more factored in, but caste is the idea of the social hierarchy in Indian society of caste is almost not factored in when we're looking at the separations certainly not in environmental policy, but other places as well. It seemed that the systems of justice or the political state were far away, inaccessible, or just not designed to reach them. And I saw this very closely when I was working for 2.5 years with migrant labor, that the idea of the state was so distant from their own state of life. And the idea of access to anything which we call systems of justice or of the state were absolutely, even the present, were inaccessible, even psychologically inaccessible to them. Environmental laws, in fact, and there are these are sometimes environmental laws are counterproductive to the most vulnerable and can marginalize the vulnerable even more. I saw this when I was photographing the forgotten river in the megapolis of Delhi, polluted, uncared for, yet a site for all the city did not want, which was junk and the poor. In one case, over 100,000 of such people, inhabitants, were evicted from the riverbank in the course of a few days owing to a High Court order. The order was based on a governmental affidavit which claimed that these people were the cause of pollution in the river. It begged the question, if people do not have water to drink, how do they create sewage? Then there are similar cases of forest laws used to evict indigenous people from forests. There are numerous such cases. This particular image is from a work I did with a certain community, a particular community, which also had been displaced because of forest laws. The forest laws are actually protecting certain kind of key species in the forest, but are excluding people who live there. There have been some changes in the forest laws, but the implementation of those laws are still very suspect. There also have been displacements because of, not because of laws, but because of new kind of thinking about what global cities are meant to look like. For example, there are farming villages which grow marigold on the river, on its fertile floodplain, flood-silted banks on the river Yamuna. The river is also a site for everyday ritualistic celebration of the mother goddess Yamuna. It's a revered river by those who relate to its waters as holy and sacred, despite its material blackness. The marigold horticulture is carried out without fertilizer or pesticides as community farming which engages the women of the village. Today, as real estate becomes increasingly scarce in the 15 million populated city, there are plans to urbanize this land in sustainable ways and shrink the place for worship. It is strange that what seems already sustainable is being changed in the name of sustainability, and it's obvious that the fertility of capital seems to be more than the fertility of land. In my more recent work with the fishers in South India, where I spent some time, I observed that within even fishing communities, there's a hierarchy within the same community of people who have access to technology and people who don't have access to technology. There are those fishers who had some capital to pool in as groups and tie in with local businesses to upgrade their fishing vessels. These translated into a bigger engine, bigger boats which carried up to 4 fishers, bigger nets, and an ability to go out further into the sea from an earlier 2 kilometer to 20 kilometers, which resulted in bigger fish catch. The solo traditional fishers with their paddle boats came home with smaller and smaller fish catches every day. As fewer fish were available close to the shore, they were slowly moving away from fishing to other supplemental jobs. As the beach was being taken up by tourism and new inns and hotels came up, these fishers were engaging with housekeeping and cleaning. Many had sent their sons to vocational schools to turn them away from fishing. From them, a generation-old livelihood was its end. Also, along with them and speaking with them, I discovered that as they disappear, along with them disappear the deep knowledge they had of fish, their spawning and ability to read the sea, and the reverence they held the waters in. It was a slow disappearance of an ecosystem understanding rooted in livelihood, culture, mythology, and language. I want to now turn to an example of the decimation of the vulture. Since what is polluted or toxic is largely seen from the anthropogenic viewpoint, when it comes to the non-human animal, the effect can be even more disastrous, for they're largely invisible. Of the 100,000 chemicals available, many of them have not been tested for human impacts, and almost none of them are even required to be tested for non-human impacts, since these are even lower down the hierarchy of concern. Even after a century after Rachel Carson's dire warnings, the ecosystem impacts have not been studied enough or adequately brought into normative standards. As an example is the recent near decimation of the South Asian vulture. From a thriving population of over 40 million in the 1980s, it had shrunk to less than 1% of its size by the early 2000s. In 20 years, the vulture had been rendered almost extinct. A popular painkiller, diclofenac, had caused this. When given to the livestock to reduce its pain, owing to excessive and brutal milking, it destroyed the vulture's kidneys when it fed on their carcasses. Behind these were procedures which allowed new chemicals and drugs to be introduced in the markets. Then there's another example of a fish called hilsa, which migrates from the Ganga estuary upstream to this Himalayan origin to spawn. And because of the redesigning of the rivers, for example, as big dams and barrages, these fish cannot migrate upstream anymore. Not only in law, but in how things are engineered, how landscapes are thought about, the non-human almost does not figure. There have been recent questions about, like that of the ecological flow. What should the ecological flow in a river be? And to answer that question requires a deep knowledge of the biodiversity of what is the minimum water flow a river should hold. What does minimum contain? What is the river about? Is it just a channel of water, or is it a life support system? And often these questions are not being able to answer it properly because there's not enough work done on the biosystems, or not enough evidence produced, or which can be brought up as making a case in point. And this brings me to the first point I'd like to make, that what I see in the policy-making circles is both that the evidence for the non-human, the biosystems, is lacking. They have not been studied enough, and if they have been studied enough, they have not been elevated enough to the level of political recognition. And I was wondering if there's a way to change that, whether academic questions or scientific questions could be addressed, which addresses particular policy gaps or the particular policy questions which are actually changing landscapes today as we speak, and whether they can help change how we think about these landscapes in a more empirical way, because that's how policy works besides its political underpinnings. The second point I'd like to make is about thinking of more foundational approaches for how we inhabit ecosystems. And this is a question I've been thinking about for a long time. And thinking about how relationships with nature are multidimensional. We know that, I suggest that the ecological crisis, as we call it, as we use that word now quite often, it's less about what is going wrong, but about what's going on in the relationship. And we focus on the relationship which we have to the non-human, and it's only through the change in these relationships we'll be able to shift the idea of how to reverse the trend of what's going wrong. Because all of the trajectories are leading down the same trajectories of more capital and market-based solutions, which are not really fundamentally changing the way we think of nature or think of the non-human. And one way is by helping preserving ecosystems of biology, culture, and livelihoods on the ground, which might also help cohabit with the myriad of life around us. We know for a long time, at least people who live in nature, live off landscapes, in landscapes, that the non-human-human relationship is not a fixed one or singular. While the non-human as a category called nature has been lately contested, the human also needs to be questioned and expanded. What constitutes the boundary of the self, and how is the self internalized? I like to quote something which Akhil Bilgrami, the philosopher, and I had a conversation with recently. And he, in his writings, also cites both Gandhi and Marx as those who spoke of the non-alienated self, although in very different ways. Marx speaks, as you know, of the alienation of the body, for example, of the body of the fish from water as it lives, and when water becomes polluted, the fish cannot survive it anymore. The water becomes an expanded body of the fish. Gandhi, on the other hand, speaks of the moral self as an Hindu idea of a cosmic self. Though I must state that the historian Ramchandra Guha states that ironically, who's written extensively on Gandhi, Gandhi was by all accounts himself profoundly indifferent to the wild. So it does not necessarily mean that how Gandhi thinks about the self automatically means it includes the non-human. Also in my work with the fishing community, I had a very interesting observation. I spent a lot of time talking to them about what they thought of the sea, and compared to what I thought of the sea. And all the words which they used about the sea were were not about an aesthetic abstraction of it. I thought of the sea as a beautiful or stormy or some kind of meta system out there. And the words they used for the sea were very functional, very political, very everyday. And it showed to me that the assumptions that we make about what nature is doesn't really translate into people who actually live in those landscapes. And I was thinking about why these abstractions take place from this idea of nature as an abstract idea. In fact, the writer Amitav Ghosh has written extensively on this, and in one of his writings he cites a tale of Bon Bibi, the forest lady of the Bengal Sindhubans. She is woven into the everyday life of the villagers as a way to coexist with the man-eating Royal Bengal tigers which lived there. He writes, the Bon Bibi legend used the power of fiction to create and define a relationship between human beings and the natural world. Nowhere does a term equivalent to nature figure in the legend of Bon Bibi, yet nowhere is its consciousness absent. Although ecological concerns are never named, the story is profoundly informed by that awareness which the literary critic Larry Buell has termed the environmental unconscious, a phrase that is all more useful in my view because it does not invoke the cultural and linguistic freightage of the word nature. And I find it everywhere in the communities I interact and work with, that this idea of nature is inherent but not present in the same way as we describe it, or as I describe it as an urban citizen. Again, another filmmaker, Nilanjan Bhattacharya, who's done extensive work on food cultures of indigenous peoples in India, it talks about taking from nature in order to live in nature, but not take with impunity. Reflected in their social world through rituals of reciprocation, respect shown to nature, to respect debt and gratitude, expressing a restorative relationship with it. In addition, there's an element of forgiveness. And Akhil Bilgrami privately remarked that these moral psychological responses about taking from nature are very different from the situation found in it in the sphere of the state and the collective issues there, on the matter of taking and debt. In the collective sphere of the state and governance, a great deal of debt needs no moral psychological response of any kind, no feelings of guilt, no feelings of gratitude, no asking for forgiveness. And he suggests that this is a new area which is not thought about, of in what area is this idea of taking and debt thought about in philosophically. Sakshi today has already spoken about the cases where the non-human or the animals have been brought up in law, especially on grounds of compassion, but in very controversial ways as well. For example, when she cited this issue of the Jallikattu, it led to a huge protest all over Tamil Nadu, the state where Jallikattu or bull racing takes place. And it shows the complexity of those relationships with animals. In fact, one suggestion was that if you take away Jallikattu, then there'll be no incentive to protect the traditional bull there anymore. Radhika Govindarajan, a scholar from Chicago, has written a book called Animal Intimacies, where she explores these very lived relationships with animals as an ethnographer, and I think which are very revealing and contest this idea of animal sacrifice as it's talked about by animal activists. This idea of just supporting what Sakshi says about personhood, which has been brought about in sort of very romantic ways but we have no basis in legal spheres, and often these orders of personhood of the river or of bringing fundamental rights to birds have free to fly, etc. They don't go very far because there's no basis either socially or legally for them. Lastly, I'd just like to end by saying that the current understanding of nature to be included in a modern formal legal policy framework, which allows today only for a certain kind of scientific knowledge as evidence, may need a radical reformulation of the sphere in which the human-non-human relationship is thought about. Besides only addressing the issue of human inequity, it also needs to address the co-constituency between human and the non-human, and a more extensive and inclusive comprehension of environment and nature should be thought about. This last image I leave you is performatory art project I participated in, actually helped develop, called Landscape as Evidence, Artists as Witness. And you can Google it, you can see it on the web. It's actually talking how to think about affective knowledge to bring into the forensic architecture of the legal systems, and which really means you have to expand what we think as evidence, not necessarily only think of law as something which takes certain kind of evidence, but what is evidence in law is also a question which comes up. Thank you very much.